Have you ever wondered what lurks behind the eyes of a villain? We're not talking about monsters born evil, but complex minds, forged by experiences that distort the perception of reality. What if I told you that the villain you know might actually be a mirror of our own vulnerabilities? Prepare to dive into a psychological abyss that will make you question everything you think about darkness. In a kingdom where beauty was the most valuable currency and vulnerability a silent condemnation, a girl was born, destined to become the feared Queen Ravenna. Her journey, far from a gloomy fairy tale, is a profound study of how a tormented mind is shaped. Ravenna did not emerge from nothing as the cruel queen history portrayed. She was, first and foremost, a survivor. Her childhood, marked by abuse and exploitation, taught her a brutal and indelible lesson. Beauty was not just a gift, but the only real tool for protection and advancement in a world that saw her as an object to be used and discarded. Imagine a child forced to grow up in a scenario where innocence is a dangerous luxury and fragility an invitation to pain. For Ravenna, the world was not a place of safety or affection, but a relentless stage where appearance dictated her destiny and her ability to avoid suffering. This early and distorted perception irrevocably shaped her psyche, transforming beauty from an attribute into an impenetrable armor and, at the same time, a lethal weapon. Every compliment, every admiring glance was not just recognition, but a validation of the only strategy she knew worked to keep herself safe and, somehow, in control of her own existence. She didn't just value her beauty. She idolized it as an existential shield, a fundamental barrier against the suffering that had marked every fiber of her youth, a youth stolen by necessity. It is on this fertile ground of traumatic experiences and conditional validation that we can identify the first psychological trait that would define her, the solid foundation for what would become a narcissistic personality disorder. In its essence, pathological narcissism is not merely vanity, but a complex and fragile defensive construct. For Ravenna, her beauty became the very foundation of her identity, a vital necessity for her own existence and sense of self-worth. She could not afford to be just beautiful. She needed to be the most beautiful, the unattainable, for only then did she believe she was safe from the repetition of her traumas. This fixation rooted itself so deeply that it became the lens through which she interpreted all interactions, all threats, and all reflections, turning the world into a mirror where only her image mattered. But something was coming that no one saw, a seed of darkness that would germinate into a cruel future. The turning point in Ravenna's life was not a single explosive event, but a progressive erosion of her sense of security, paved by a series of experiences that collectively catalyzed her transformation. The most potent trigger and the engine of her escalating cruelty was the overwhelming fear of losing what she valued most, her beauty. For a mind already fragile and hypervigilant due to past traumas, any hint of physical decline or threat to her image was interpreted not as the natural course of life, but as a harbinger of catastrophe, rekindling the primordial fear of being unprotected, powerless, and worse, exploited once more. The anxiety of the passage of time transformed into an existential terror, a relentless enemy she desperately needed to defeat. This internal fragility, paradoxically, propelled her to seek obsessive and absolute control over her appearance and, by extension, over everything around her. With every imperceptible wrinkle, with every young woman who blossomed in beauty and stood out, Ravenna's paranoia intensified in dizzying spirals. She didn't just see a mirror of her own aging. She saw a conspiracy orchestrated to bring her down, to steal the only thing that, in her twisted logic, kept her relevant, powerful, and safe. Female rivalry, which for balanced minds would be a matter of ego or superficial competition, for Ravenna was an existential battle, a matter of symbolic life or death, where the price of defeat was the complete annihilation of her being. Psychology explains this transformation through the intensification of dysfunctional defense mechanisms. Instead of processing trauma in a healthy way, Ravenna developed extreme and destructive defenses. Her obsession with youth and her relentless cruelty towards other beautiful women are clear manifestations of her projection and denial. She projects her own deepest fears of aging, losing control, and being replaced onto her victims. At the same time, she denies herself the inevitable reality of time's passage, seeking eternal youth through dark and barbaric means. This desperate and irrational pursuit of permanent beauty became a vicious cycle of aggression, where every cruel act was justified as a measure of extreme self-preservation, a desperate attempt to retain the power and validation her beauty once gave her. And it was there that everything began to crumble, paving the way for even greater darkness, where hope had no place. Over time, Ravenna's mind not only adapted to her neuroses, but molded itself into a distorted and impenetrable fortress, where every thought, every emotion, and every action was justified by an implacable and circular internal logic. Her paranoia and narcissistic disorder became inextricably intertwined, creating a worldview where she was not just the center, but also the target of a constant and omnipresent conspiracy. For Ravenna, the world was not a place of peaceful coexistence, but a perpetual battlefield, and she believed she needed to be the last one standing, not out of unbridled ambition, but out of pure necessity for survival. Her existence was perceived as a grueling daily struggle against an invisible yet ever-present threat, lurking, ready to consume her. Iconic lines like, "I am the mirror," and her unwavering conviction that beauty is a weapon reveal the depth and perversion of her cognitive distortion. Every reflection in a mirror, for her, was not just an image. It was a confirmation of her power and, at the same time, a constant reminder of the imminent danger of losing it. She saw herself as a queen in perpetual check, constantly threatened by younger, more beautiful rivals, each a potential harbinger of her own ruin and the collapse of her identity. To delve into Ravenna's mind is to understand that, for her, cruelty was not a sadistic whim, but a strategically and coldly calculated necessity, an essential move to eliminate any competition and reassert her unquestionable supremacy. She felt no remorse, only the urgency to act. We can use the analogy of an overactive autoimmune system. Just as a body, in its dysfunction, attacks its own healthy cells, Ravenna's psyche voraciously attacked any perceived threat to her sovereignty, even if that threat was just the natural and innocent beauty of another woman. The disorganized attachment theory in the field of developmental psychology can help us understand this complex structure. Individuals with this attachment pattern, often resulting from early and inconsistent traumas, develop inconsistent, sometimes paradoxical and destructive strategies to cope with fear and the search for security. For Ravenna, the only form of connection was absolute control, and the only form of security was the preemptive elimination of any perceived challenge, resulting in a vicious cycle of aggression to ensure a pseudo-security that was never truly achieved, as the threat existed more in her mind than in reality. But the true monster, in all its breadth and horror, was still dormant, awaiting the moment of its full manifestation and dominion. The act of transgression that solidified Ravenna's descent into the deepest abyss of depravity was her conscious and deliberate decision to sacrifice the lives of other innocent women to sustain her own youth and vitality. This was not an impulsive act, driven by momentary fury, but the inevitable climax of a twisted logic, where self-preservation taken to the extreme became the sole law and moral compass. In that terrible moment, Ravenna's worldview became absolute and unquestionable. Life was a zero-sum game, a board where she would do absolutely whatever was necessary to win, regardless of the human cost to others. Herself became the only entity with intrinsic value, and everyone else was mere resources, fuel for her own survival and ascent. Her morality and ethics were completely subverted, not just ignored, but actively redefined under the aegis of survival. For Ravenna, the lives of her victims were insignificant, disposable, compared to her own existence, power, and the primordial need to maintain her youth. She rationalized her most abominable actions as mere necessary consequences of her pursuit of survival and control, convinced that the world, in its essence, conspired against her and that her extreme measures were justified and, indeed, heroic in their own twisted right. "I just do what's necessary to stay strong," was the silent and perverse mantra echoing in her mind, transforming her victims into mere objects, vital resources for her own maintenance and power. Empathy was completely absent, eradicated and replaced by a chilling and cruel pragmatism, a logic that recognized no one else's pain, only her own. At this point, the spectator is violently confronted with a disturbing dilemma. What if, from Ravenna's perspective, within her own bubble of delusion and trauma, she was right? If a cruel world taught her from an early age that beauty was her only value and that fragility would lead to her annihilation, wouldn't her actions, however terrible, be a logical and understandable response to that existential premise? The question that haunts and pursues us is, to what extent does the desperate pursuit of survival justify the complete loss of humanity? Where do we draw the thin, sometimes indistinct, line between the victim who suffered and the aggressor who inflicts pain, when the aggressor was one day a helpless victim? This is the true and disturbing moral crossroads that Queen Ravenna presents to us, forcing us to confront our own concepts of good and evil, and to understand that darkness can have complex roots. Chapter 5. The Science of Horror, the Logic of Destruction. The depth of Queen Ravenna's mind is chillingly consistent and logical within her own distorted psychic structure. Her pathological obsession with beauty and youth, far from being a mere vain whim, is a direct and inevitable reflection of her deep narcissistic pathology and incapacitating paranoia. For her, beauty is not a superficial adornment, but the central pillar of her existence and identity, and youth, the only guarantee of her invincibility and power. Psychological analysis reveals that this fixation is an extreme manifestation of the fear of ego annihilation, where the loss of her idealized identity equates, in her mind, to death itself, to the complete erasure of her essence and relevance. We can see clear parallels with self-determination theory, where the basic psychological needs for competence and autonomy, when deeply frustrated or distorted by trauma, lead to extreme controlling behaviors and ultimately destructive ones. Ravenna, in her frantic pursuit of being the most beautiful and powerful, feels an uncontrollable compulsion to eliminate anyone who threatens her status, her image, or her perceived power. Her actions are not impulsive. They are meticulously calculated, each aimed at maintaining her iron grip and warding off the terrifying specter of aging, loss of beauty, and consequent irrelevance. She operates under a closed belief system, where every action, no matter how cruel, is a desperate defense against an imminent and existential danger she perceives as constant and overwhelming. Comparing her to historical figures known for their cruelty, or other fictional characters who seek immortality or absolute power, we perceive a consistent pattern. The unwavering belief that the end justifies the means, the complete dehumanization of the other to justify atrocious acts, and the absolute inability to empathize are recurring traits in individuals who operate from a destructive and egocentric logic. An in-depth study of hubris syndrome, which describes the alteration of behavior and personality in leaders who attain great power and become detached from reality, can offer additional insights, showing how unlimited power can corrode an individual's morality and sanity, leading them to increasingly extreme acts. It was not irrational madness. It was a cold and precise calculation, based on an unwavering and distorted belief that she alone was worthy of all power, all beauty, and all vitality, and that all means were valid to achieve them. Queen Ravenna's legacy is a kingdom marked not only by physical ruins, but by a profound legacy of fear, oppression, and despair, a grim mirror of her own tormented mind and the destruction she sowed. Her relentless and sadistic pursuit of youth and power left an indelible trail of suffering and hopelessness, showing how individual obsession and psychopathy can reverberate catastrophically, shaping the destiny and psyche of an entire people. The world around her became a terrifying reflection of her paranoia, a place where beauty was a curse, an invitation to annihilation, and life, a cheap and disposable commodity. The society she governed was completely drained of its vitality, its hope, and its humanity, reflecting the crushing price of her insatiable quest, a true existential void. Ravenna's story invites us to a deep and uncomfortable philosophical reflection. Who are we, as observers, to judge the actions of someone who was molded and distorted by such pain, trauma, and abuse in their upbringing? If her worldview was brutally built on the unwavering idea that cruelty and domination are the only forms of survival and protection, wouldn't her choices, however dark and abhorrent, be a logical and predictable manifestation of her internal struggle to exist? Ravenna's complex narrative challenges our simplistic conception of good and evil, forcing us to look at the intricate nuances and gray areas of the human psyche. It reminds us that often the most terrible and inhuman acts are born from deep fears, unprocessed traumas, and a distorted perception of reality, where one's very existence seems to be under constant, imminent threat. The central and disturbing question remains: can we truly condemn without reservation a creature who was, in her essence, molded and twisted by the suffering and brutality of the world? Ravenna's legacy extends beyond her own downfall, suggesting that the seeds of chaos can be planted again. But perhaps she was not the last of her kind, and the darkness she represented still hovers, awaiting a new host, a new victim of herself. We arrive at the final dive into the complexity of Queen Ravenna, where the line between victim and monster dissolves into an intricate tapestry of pain and power. This final chapter does not seek to absolve her actions, but to understand the underlying tragedy of her existence. Ravenna, in her essence, became the personification of the trauma that consumed her. She was initially a wounded child, exploited and devalued, who learned to associate her survival with her beauty and the control she exerted over others. This twisted equation became the foundation of her identity, leading her to believe that, to no longer be the prey, she needed to become the predator. Psychology teaches us that the perpetuation of the cycle of abuse is a painful and frequently observed pattern. Victims of trauma can, in their quest for control and security, replicate the behavioral patterns they suffered, becoming, in turn, aggressors. Ravenna is a classic example of this dynamic. The terror of aging and losing her beauty, for her, was not superficial vanity. It was the panic of returning to the vulnerability of her youth, of being discarded, exploited, and hurt again. Her terror of fragility propelled her to commit unimaginable acts of cruelty, all in the name of a false sense of security and power. Every life she took was, in her mind, a necessary sacrifice to ward off the ghost of her own past. The great lesson that Queen Ravenna's story leaves us is that darkness can be contagious. The cycle of pain and the pursuit of power, when rooted in unresolved traumas, can generate monsters who are, paradoxically, the greatest victims of their own history. Her downfall was not just the defeat of a villain, but the inevitable consequence of a soul that lost itself in a desperate attempt to protect itself. Her story is a warning about the dangers of untreated pain and distorted power, a grim reminder that sometimes the greatest cruelty is born from the greatest suffering. The final question lingers. Can we, as a society that often creates the conditions for such traumas, truly distance ourselves from our share of responsibility when the victim transforms into an aggressor. The journey through Queen Ravenna's mind reveals an uncomfortable and disturbing truth. Darkness does not always originate from emptiness or innate evil, but from deep wounds that refuse to heal, and that, instead, fester and consume the soul. Her story forces us to question the limits of compassion and condemnation. To what extent do circumstances and trauma shape the monster? And when is the responsibility for their actions purely individual? Perhaps the true horror lies not in villainy itself, but in the human fragility that precedes it, and in how primitive fear can transform a victim into an aggressor, perpetuating a cycle of pain. And this makes us wonder, what other queens are being molded now, in silence, by their own scars?